Joining us now, the aforementioned senator from the great state of Kentucky, Rand Paul, presidential candidate out on the trail. Senator Paul, great to talk to you. What is your reaction to Rubio hitting you both yesterday? Politico wrote a big piece about it. Seems like a new phase in his war against the opposition.
Well, I would remind the country that Marco Rubio has opposed everything that we have tried to do to control our borders, to make it such that people can't come in here to attack us under false pretenses. When the immigration bill came up, I put forward an amendment that would have added new structure and new strictures on student visas from the Middle East, on visitor visas from the Middle East, on immigrants from the Middle East, saying, you know what, you can't come from some of these countries that have radical jihadist movements unless you pass this extra scrutiny. And yesterday I reintroduced some of those concepts, but Marco Rubio has opposed that every time. He and Chuck Schumer had basically a secret agreement that they would oppose all conservative amendments to the immigration bill. And when he did this, he also made, I think, us less safe, because the border is also a national security issue. And I've been saying all along that there's about 30 to 35 countries, we list them in our bill, that have jihadist movements, that we are fools to let people come over here from those countries.
So your amendment that was offered during Gang of Eight, and I remember we had you on at the time, involved that the visa restrictions from the high-risk nations, correct?
Yeah, what it said is for the high-risk nations that we would have to have a greater degree of scrutiny, and actually we had some rules. We said we had to know 100% of the time who's coming and leaving, entry and exit, before we began readmitting these people to our country or allowing them to come and visit. And this is a big question, whether or not, because it's not only these 30 countries that are a danger to us, French citizens of Moroccan descent or of descent from countries that have jihadist movements are a threat to us too. So my bill that I put forward now says that you have to have a 30-day waiting period before you can come, even as a French citizen, because, see, the attackers the other day in Paris, most of them were actually French citizens, and that's a visa waiver country, so they would not even need a visa to visit the United States.
Well, it seems that given the severity of the threat against the free world, all of these visa issuances have to be reexamined. How we do it, how we conduct ourselves at the border, and so forth. But what was their justification for opposing one of the new provisions in the amendment that you offered a few years ago? Because as far as I'm checking here, it seems to be very consistent with what the 9/11 Commission recommended with a biometric entry-exit system that apparently was just never really instituted.
Well, basically, Marco Rubio decided that his allegiance to Chuck Schumer was greater than his allegiance to conservative ideas, because these were all very reasonable ideas. My intention, actually, and you know this, I've had feelings that we should do something on immigration, because if we do nothing, I think it's sort of de facto amnesty if we do no immigration reform. And I was trying to make Marco's bill better, but he and Chuck Schumer decided that they weren't going to block all amendments because they basically made a deal. That deal was, we will allow no amendments regardless of the content. But here now I think it's coming back to bite Marco, because I think he weakened our defenses by allowing people to come into our country without sufficient scrutiny. I was trying to bolster our defenses by saying, you know what, from these countries that have radical Islamic movements, we need to have heightened scrutiny, not less scrutiny.
We're talking to Senator Rand Paul, candidate for the presidency here on the Laura Ingraham Show. The opening that they believe exists, Senator Paul, is that at a time where Americans feel less secure and they're seeing this carnage befalling one of our closest allies, that they will be much more willing and interested in committing ground troops and more military spending to the Middle East, specifically Syria, maybe more in Iraq. And that clearly has motivated Rubio, I think, and Bush to step up and say, okay, you can't kid around with these isolationist types. You can't kid around with these people who just don't want to take the fight to the enemy. Do you feel that scenario playing out now?
The better description is the difference between Marco Rubio and I is I would prioritize defense spending. I would defend the country. I'll do whatever it takes to defend the country, but I won't do it by borrowing more money from China. So when Marco has introduced increases in defense spending, I have countered those with an increase that cuts spending to pay for it. And he's opposed every time that I've tried to cut spending to pay for increases in defense spending. He has opposed that. He has only introduced increases in military spending that are not offset by cuts in other spending. And I just think that's fiscally irresponsible, and I think that's actually, what the liberals have always done. We bring in $3 trillion. I'm for devoting a large percentage of that to defending the country, but I'm not for spending $4 trillion when we only bring in $3 trillion. I think that's irresponsible, and I think that's Marco Rubio's position.
And on the issue of what we would do other than fortifying our borders and so forth, on the question of refugees, Rubio has had positions that have shifted somewhat, and others have as well. Tell me exactly where you stand on this, and has your position changed given what happened in Paris?
Our position is similar to what it's always been, and that's that people shouldn't be allowed to come to this country without having a lot better scrutiny than we have currently. I was concerned when the Boston bombing occurred. I was one of the loudest voices saying, look, how did these people get into our country? They came as refugees. I was a loud voice because in my town, Bowling Green, Kentucky, we admitted 2 Iraqi refugees who then decided it was a good idea to buy Stinger missiles. And we caught them, fortunately, before they did. But there are many examples of refugees coming here under false pretenses and then attacking us. And until we can assure that the country knows who these people are and that we know where everyone is in the country that might attack us. For example, they say there are 11 million people in our country and 40% of them are visa overstays. Do we know where they are? And are we doing anything about it? We can't find them. And so if you extrapolate that to foreign students and people from the Middle East that are in our country, could we assume that 40% of them are here overstaying their visas, and do we know where they are? Until we know where everyone is, that everyone's obeying the law, and that only people that are properly vetted are coming in, I'd say no more refugees, but I also say no immigrants, no students, and no visitors from about 30 countries until we're absolutely certain they're not coming to attack us.
Well, I think looking at these new polls, the people seem to be with your position. I mean, 53%, 52% say that allowing in refugees makes the country less secure. 63% just overall very concerned about the the vulnerability of the United States under these circumstances. But do you think it's a misreading of the public sentiment, Senator Paul, for Republicans to believe that you can win this election by beating the war drum for more troops in the Middle East next fall? I mean, do you think that beats Hillary Clinton, that going back to war?
No, and in fact, I think people are still very hesitant to send ground troops back over there. But I will say one more thing on the refugees. I was on the phone last night with folks from Kentucky, and one of them was a disabled soldier who was wounded in the war, and he's talking about how hard it is to struggle on what he gets to live on. And I contrast that with the refugees that we bring over here. We put them on 100% welfare. It's the only immigrant status that qualifies for welfare immediately, and that's refugees. And so we have veterans we can't take care of. We have unemployed people in Kentucky that are struggling for jobs, and we're going to import people that we put on our welfare system. That's a disgrace and a disaster. With regard to the war, I don't think America in general thinks that putting 100,000 troops or 500,000 troops in the Middle East is the answer. Ultimately, the lasting peace, and I'm not saying we do nothing. I am for aerial bombardment in support of on-the-ground Arab troops. I'm for giving arms and selling arms and getting them directly to the Kurds. But the ultimate victory has to be from Sunni Muslims. It's going to have to be Sunni Muslims saying to these radical, aberrant Sunni Muslims that they're wrong and that Islam is not in support of killing civilians and children and terrorism. When that happens, there'll be a lasting peace. But if Americans or French or Europeans try to defeat ISIS, we will. We'll defeat them, and another generation will rise up saying we have to kill the infidel. But if the native Muslim people, the Arabs who live in that area, rise up and stamp out ISIS with our help, then I think you can have a lasting peace.
So are you closer to Obama's position or Rubio's position?
No, actually, I think Rubio and Obama and Hillary Clinton are very similar.
How?
Rubio and Hillary Clinton supported the war in Libya. They've all supported arming the allies of al-Qaeda in Syria. So I've really opposed Rubio and Hillary Clinton and Obama on all of this. So I really think that what I've said before, Hillary Clinton's a neocon, but so is Marco Rubio. they've been for every war in the Middle East, and I think most of the interventions in the recent history have actually backfired on us.
And we've talked a little bit about the Trans-Pacific Partnership before, but now that the text of the 5,500-page document has been released, some of our trade experts have gone through the document. I've only read like 100 pages of it, and boy, is it complicated. But on one chapter, specifically Chapter 10, Senator, there's a provision that allows foreign companies to bring in an unlimited number of foreign workers into the United States, and they can be paid wages that are commensurate to wages paid in their home countries. That means the L1 visa program, any restrictions on that, any culling of the candidates, that's out the window, and all of them that want to come in, courtesy of these companies, can come in. A lot of concern about that, obviously, for American workers, and concern that China will obviously be able to benefit in many different ways by this as well, tangentially. What is your take on this Trans-Pacific Partnership today?
Well, I've been a big opponent of giving the president the authority to do this without congressional input, without amendment in the Senate, and without the ability to filibuster it. To tell you the truth, have not made it through the 5,000 pages, but I am a big believer on if you can't read a bill, you shouldn't support it. And so unless I can get all the way through it, my staff is helping me go through it, unless we can get all the way through it and feel comfortable that we're supportive of it, I won't support it. But I haven't made a final decision on the document because I just really, frankly, it's enormous. And
what good comes of a 5,000-page document, Senator? I mean, you've been around this town long enough. I mean, nothing good comes of that. Not when it's negotiated overseas by some unaccountable group of global bureaucrats, including Michael Froman from the USTR.
I think that is generally the rule, but we're going to keep looking at it. The other thing is that's generally the rule is that when you give up authority to international bodies, we get bullied by two-bit third world dictators in the UN and all these different international bodies. I don't like giving up sovereignty to international bodies, so a big concern for me will not only be the trade aspects of this, not only the visa aspects of it, but for me whether or not we will be giving power to organizations that are outside our jurisdiction, or whether or not we'll be giving them power within our country. And that's always been a big concern of mine, is whether or not these World Trade Organization or any of these organizations have the ability to actually regulate our country, advocate for tax increases in our country or regulatory burden in our country. And that's some of how they make trade supposedly fair, is they say, oh, U.S. may have an advantage because your taxes are lower on this particular item. And I wish that was more often the case, that our taxes were lower. Sometimes it's the reverse now. But I think that I don't want an international body telling us we need to either raise taxes or increase regulations to meet some kind of worldwide standard.
Rand Paul, great luck out there. Thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.